Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. Have you ever taken a look at a Mosin Nagant bolt and on this side found these really weird series of markings on it? Well, if you have, you're not alone. In fact, I actually have been asked this, I think, a few times, most recently by actually one of our viewers in France named Henri, and he was actually looking at a listing for one of these guns. Specifically, it was a Finnish 9130 rifle in a potbelly stock. And he was wondering about these weird markings on the bolt. Let's take a little bit of a closer look so I can show you exactly what we're talking about here. Now, these markings are all sort of crazy, and they range from sort of barely visible to I have no idea what this is. And we'll see it here typically on the right side of the bolt body, which is this whole main piece here. And we see it looks like an O, a T, that looks like a K there. That looks like pi, not the American apple pie that we love here, the symbol pi, like 3.14. Although I don't think that's necessarily what this indicates. I don't think someone wanted to associate this with 3.14159.265 and so on. Instead, I think this is just a Greek letter, and that's really all it means. And we see some other weird things here. Looks like an O in a circle, a 3 in a circle. That's interesting. I haven't seen that one before. And then this one's neat. We see a T in a circle. Then we see another K, kind of similar to this one, although this K is a little bit larger. And then that might be a marking. I'm not exactly sure. So what are these markings and where do we see them? Well, first of all, we don't exactly know what these mean. But we can take a gander, as we say here in America. We can say, I take a gander and say that there's probably some inspector marks. Now, inspector marks we see on all sorts of different parts and variants of Mosins. We see it on parts. On 9130s especially, we see it on the barrel shanks, as well as the receivers. And these markings are actually really fascinating, and we don't talk enough about them, I don't think, because we see them a lot, especially on the earlier guns, but we just never talk about it. Now, before we go into a little bit deeper dive on some of these markings, where do we see this particular sequence of markings? Because not every Mosin bolt you have, you're going to see these markings. The vast majority of Mosin bolts, you won't. But sometimes you'll see this weird line of markings. And the key is this guy right here. See this bow and arrow? That tells us that this bolt body was produced by the Ijev's factory before 1928. And this is the only type of bolt where you will see these markings appear, is on pre-1928 Ijevs. I studied a lot of Mosins. You don't see them on Tulas, any of the American contracts. You don't see them in World War II. You don't see them on the Châtellerault contract bolt bodies made in the mid-1890s in France. You don't see them on Sistrayetsk bolt bodies. You only see them on Ijevs produced before 1928. And really, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because Mosins have been through a lot, and a lot of the markings by various countries, especially Finland, but also in the Balkan area, have been either just worn away or ground off and remarked or reserialized. So finding original Mosin Nagant pieces and parts like this can be a really big challenge. So we really have to work with what we have. Now, I have some good news with that. This particular bolt body is the original serial number, 135065. So as far as I can tell, I'm still doing research, and y'all know that, but as far as I can tell, you really only see these markings pre-World War I on Ijev's bolt bodies. So this can be kind of a helpful way to date your bolt body. If you see this, it's really old, probably over 100 years old, at least at the filming of this video. But there's one other nice thing about this. Now, this particular bolt came off of a Finnish M91 rifle. But here's where it gets really weird, because most parts that come off of Finnish Mosins, well, like I said, they tend to be force matched. Now, force match is an interesting term because we usually associate that with 9130 rifles. Usually you may hear the term Finn matching, which means it was force matched by Finland. However, this one is one of the weird counterexamples that came from Finland, but they didn't force match it. So this is the original serial number as far as I can tell, and here's why I think that. Now the font doesn't seem like a Finnish font, and this is where it gets tricky because finding original like pre-World War I fonts that haven't been ground off is pretty difficult on Mosins. But this gets more interesting. If we take a look back here, we need to look at our cocking piece. Now we see here our cocking piece is also marked pre-1928 Izhevsk. But this is where it gets really fabulous, okay? If we look on the back here, we can see our cocking piece is also serialized 135065 in the same font. So it actually matches the bolt. This is a rare example of a Finnish bolt that's original and matching. Now, it's not totally matching. This is where it gets tricky because how do we define matching? Are we talking about matching numbers? In that case, this is matching. But if we look at the other parts, the connecting bar was actually produced by Remington here in America. The bolt head, I can't even tell. There's really no markings on it. The extractor, if we look at it, was produced by Sestrojetsk. So why is that? Well, really the easiest way I can explain that is disassembly. All that pulls off, and then you're left with this. This is a lot harder to separate, especially like in the field. So there's a little bit higher chance that these parts could match because over time, just no one bothered changing these. Generally, though, they won't match. So even though it's sort of difficult, a lot of times they will match them. You have to go through the work of unthreading this, which is not super difficult, but again, they just don't pull apart. The cocking piece and the bolt body don't just instantly separate for themselves, unlike some of the other parts. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go back here. Yeah, and this is weird. So sometimes you'll see the cocking piece numbered on Finnish guns, but almost always it's going to be crossed out. Now, if you remember from we talked about this from a previous video, only really early Mosins have these. Generally, when I see this, I think it's certainly pre-World War I, we know, that they stopped serializing the cocking pieces. Around the turn of the century, I would say. So generally, when you see this, it's probably going to be on an antique rifle. I'm still trying to figure out exactly where the cutoff date is here. But you won't see this on really later than World War I. This gets weird, though, because while by the time World War I came around, this would go away. We wouldn't have the stamping here. However, there's always an exception, and the exception that we've seen, if you watch some of our previous videos, is Remington actually serialized some of their cocking pieces, which is another mystery for another day. But as a whole, generally when you see this, if it's not a Remington, it's probably an antique or at least really old or close to being an antique. Now here in America, that means pre-1898, or 1899, excuse me. Okay, so with that whole rant out of the way, what else can we learn? Well, these markings are actually cool because they can also tell us if the bolt matches the cocking piece. Now, one of the ways, right, is the serialization here. And this is one thing we're still studying, is trying to figure out if this went away at the same time that this whole sequence of weird markings went away. We don't quite know, but one of the ways we can figure this out eventually is looking back here, because on an original cocking piece that matches a bolt with these markings, we'll see these same markings here on the back of the cocking piece. And some of them are a little bit different. We can see we have like an I maybe in a circle. That looks like a Cyrillic B as in Bravo in a circle. Maybe a T and then like an A. Then another T. And we saw that T here as well. Really fascinating. Now, so why do we have these weird markings here? We have some on the other side as well. Well, that's a good question. Now, it is also possible that some of those markings were on this side. We don't quite know. A lot of these markings can get worn off over time because this is where it interfaces with the side of the receiver as you're going back and forth with the bolt. Now, I could see this side wearing out more because think about it, you're pulling the bolt, and if you're right-handed, you're pulling it towards you. So you're going to be pulling it against the receiver on this side, so it's more likely to wear. So were there markings on this side as well? Because we see them back here. I don't know. More studying is required, but it's something that's interesting and it's at least worth talking about. So again, what do these markings mean? Well, they're probably inspector markings of some kind. Now, an inspector marking can mean a lot of things, but generally it's associated with someone who has a job examining a newly produced part, measuring it for whatever their position is from a tolerance standpoint. So let's say my job is to measure the inner diameter of this bolt body. Well, maybe I measure the inner diameter and then I'll put a stamp on it somewhere. Then maybe someone else measures this diameter, puts another stamp on it. It's a possibility. We don't know the ins and outs of all the Russian factories throughout the early 1900s and late 1800s. That information is just really not available to us, unfortunately, at least right now. But what's great about this is if we study enough Mosins, we can start making deductions about what these things possibly could mean. Now, we've taken a closer look at this, but I want to look at a rifle that this is related to, because we'll see something else interesting here that might lend a little bit more credence to this theory. So let me set this bolt aside. And now we're going to take a look at this. This guy is a Finnish M91 rifle with our long handguard, so this would have been used in World War I. And we can see this, like our bolt we just looked at, this rifle was produced by the Ijez factory in 1896. And what I want to look here today specifically is on this right side. We're going to see these two interesting markings. Okay, we're going to see a K within a circle and then a K not within a circle. So what are these markings exactly? Well, the K in a circle is a very common marking on Mosins. We'll see that even on 9130 rifles produced during World War II. But this marking really just means an accuracy marking. When this rifle was produced, right, a lot of people give Mosins a bad rap. Well, they all had tolerances and criteria and tests to meet, just like any other rifle. A lot of people don't really realize that or give them credit for that. But each rifle produced had to pass an accuracy test. And if it passed that accuracy test, it was stamped with a circle K. This is a very common Mosin, or marking on Mosins. Again, we'll see this from pre-World War I in 1896 all the way up into World War II. So that's really what this is. This is something else, though. This K not within a circle. We don't really know what this is. But maybe we can do a side-by-side comparison here. So we have that K, and then we also have a K here. Now that K looks a little bit different than that K, but if we look at this K right here, kind of looks like the exact same stamping as this K. See if I can get a better look at that. Okay, so you see this K, and then that K. Looks pretty similar to me, folks. There's another K here, which looks sort of, I mean, part of it's worn off, looks kind of similar to that guy. So this almost certainly is also an inspector's marking, but what it tells us is they potentially even reused the accuracy K marking stamp or had the same font produced for an inspector marking stamp on the bolt. So that's really interesting. We're going to look at more of these weird markings that we don't know about on M91s because there's tons of them, and nobody really talks about them. But I think they're worth mentioning. So again, if you see these weird markings on your bolt, sometimes this marking will be worn off. You automatically know that this is a very early bolt produced by the Ijev's factory in Russia. And these are probably some kind of interesting inspector markings. But whenever we see a marking we don't know about, we want to set it to the side, because you never know where you're going to see a marking like this again in a different place, just like we saw on our rifle barrel here. So we're going to remember these in the future. You may be surprised if and where we encounter some of these again. So thanks for watching, guys. I always enjoy looking at neat Mosin markings, and I hope you do as well. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.